Good afternoon. We're going to get started. My name is Deborah Gonzalez. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the Public Policy Institute of California, and thank you for joining us today. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank with offices both in San Francisco and Sacramento. For today's program, we're going to hear from PPI researcher Niu Gao, who will present the findings of a new PPIC report, Math Placement in California Public Schools. You should have found a copy of the report on your chair, and additionally, copies are in the back at registration. The reports are also available online. We would like to acknowledge Niu's co-author, PPIC Research Associate Sarah Aden, who is also here today. We would very much like to thank the Applied Materials Foundation and the Silicon Valley Community Foundation for their support of this work and for our event today, including the lunch. The slides from today's presentation are also available at ppic.org. After Niu's presentation, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. A few more things before we begin. Today, you will receive a short survey. We look at those surveys, and we really appreciate any of your feedback. Certainly, your positive feedback is always appreciated. And please turn off and silence your cell phones. And finally, I'd like to let you know about two upcoming events. Right after the Thanksgiving holiday, because you'll want more beer bread right after the Thanksgiving holiday, we'll be back in this room on November 29th for a special event an event on special education finance. And then December 1st, we will have the topic will be health career pathways at the California community colleges. I hope you'll join us for those events. Additional information will be posted on our website, and if you've signed up for our email, you'll get those as well. Policymakers throughout the state are working to improve college readiness for underrepresented students. Improving student access to higher level math courses is a necessary step to improving college readiness and giving students the opportunity to matriculate to our selective colleges and also close the achievement gap. Clearly, I need more coffee today, yes? Student participation, when recognizing that the importance of math placement in creating pathways to colleges last year, the California legislature passed the California Mathematics Placement Act. While today's report is based on the surveys that were completed before the requirement went into law, it will provide an important baseline for future studies on math placement. And with that, I'd like to ask Niu to come up and present her report.
Well, thank you, Deborah, for the very nice introduction, and thank you everyone for coming to today's event. And today we're going to talk about math placement policies in California's public schools with a particular focus on high schools. So this report is jointly done with Sarah Aden, who's with us today, and we will also like to thank Luna Lopez, who is on PPIC's survey team, and also Melojin Yamp, who was on PPIC's 2016 summer intern program, for their very excellent research assistance. And as Deborah mentioned, we would like to thank our funders, the Applied Material Foundation and the Silicon Valley Community Foundations, for their generous support. I'd like to start with some very general background. Taking rigorous math courses in high school is really important to students. It helps students succeed in high schools, in college, and in future labor market as well. But in practice, students' participation in those rigorous courses are oftentimes affected by district placement policies. And those are typically a set of rules that determines who gets to take which courses, when, and how. And more recently, there is some evidence suggesting that some of those school districts' policy may not be equitable. So for instance, some students are repeating Algebra 1 in 9th grade, even though they've already taken and succeeded Algebra 1 in previous years. And this problem, sometimes referred to as misplacement or displacement, occurs more frequently among Latino and African American students. So last year, the California legislature passed a law to address the equity concerns in those math placement policies. And this law, the California Mathematics Placement Act, It was formerly known as SB 359, and it was signed by the governor in October in 2015. And the law takes effect in this school year, which is the 2016 to 17 school year. The centerpiece of this law is to create a fair, objective, and transparent math placement policy. And it is up to the individual districts to create and implement their own policies. But in order to achieve its goal, the law requires districts to do a few things. So for instance, districts should consider multiple objective measures. And by using or considering objective measures, the law implicitly is asking districts to scale back on their use of teacher recommendations, because teacher recommendations are usually considered subjective measures and may be biased against particular students. And the law also requires districts to use student data to make sure that no students is being held back as a result of their placement policy. And additionally, for high school districts, the law requires them to collaborate with their feeder districts to make sure that there's a high level of consistency in their placement policies between the sending districts and the receiving districts. In this report, we're going to talk about some of those key issues concerning the new policy or the new law. And in particularly, we're going to talk about what kind of measures districts are using to place students. We're also going to talk about, are districts aware of the policy and its requirement? And if they have a placement policy, are their placement policy in compliance with the law? Additionally, we're going to look at what kind of measures districts are using to gauge the success of their own placement. And we also give districts the opportunity to tell us about the challenges and concerns they have when they're implementing the policy. And finally, we're going to conclude by talking about policy recommendations. And even though our report is motivated by SB 359, but our report goes beyond SB 359 in two ways. So first, SB 359 particularly targets 9th grade. And in our report, we look at math placement in general. So all of our findings apply to all of the grades, all of the grade levels. And the second, SB 359 talks about the traditional or the standard math placement, but we all know that in practice, what matters more to some parents are the accelerated pathways. So in our report, again, we look more broadly. So we include both standard math pathway and also accelerated pathway. So the accelerated pathways typically give students the opportunity to take some math courses earlier. So all of our findings apply to both standard pathway and also accelerated pathway as well. So in order to answer those questions, we developed a statewide survey. And in our survey, we asked districts about their placement protocols, how they develop their placement, what kind of measures they're using, and also what kind of challenges they had. And this is an online survey, and we sent out the survey earlier this spring. We're targeting unified in high school districts, and statewide there are about 420 of them, and we're able to get about half of them to respond. So we had a pretty high response rate, and our final sample is fairly representative of the state population. So California is a really diverse state. So California also has 1,000 very diverse school districts, and we're particularly interested in looking at the variation across school districts. So in order to do that, we divided those districts into different buckets or categories. So the very first group of districts we're interested in is the high need districts. Here we borrow some of the terminology from the local control funding formula, and basically those districts are districts where 55% of the students are disadvantaged, meaning that they're either English learners, foster youth, low income, or any combination of those. And statewide, 52% of unified and high school districts are high need districts. And the second group of districts we're interested in is the high performance districts. So here we picked some of the best performing districts. So for instance, those districts have made the largest gains in A through G completion in the past 10 years. And for those of you who do not know A through G, those are a set of courses that are required for admission into UC and CSU system. And also, those are adjusted gains, which mean that we've already taken into consideration student demographics, student educational needs, and district characteristics, things like that. And the last two groups of districts are pretty straightforward. So for instance, statewide, about 13% of unified and high school districts are rural districts. And for small and large, again, we picked up the bottom 25% and the top 25% of districts in terms of their student enrollment. So now let's get to the results. So the first set of questions we're interested in is how many of them had a placement policy in 2015 to 16 school year, and if they had a policy, what kind of measures are they using to place students? And this is the first result. So during the 2015 to 16 school year, remember this is before the policy takes effect. During the 2015 to 16 school year, statewide, which is the horizontal line, statewide 86% of unified and high school districts responded that they had a placement policy. And there is some very interesting variation by district characteristics. So for instance, high need districts, they're slightly less likely to have a policy, while among those high performance districts, almost everybody had a placement policy. So the next question we're interested in is what kind of measures are they using to place students? And this is a summary of the report of the results. And here in this figure, we reported two sets of numbers. The first set of numbers are those that are to the right, that you see here, and those corresponds to the percentage of districts using each measure. So for instance, if we focus on the very top bar, 94% of districts used test scores in their placement process. And the second set of numbers we report here are those solid bars that you see, and those indicate the weight or the importance of each measure. So for instance, among those districts that have used test scores, an overwhelming majority of them think that test scores are important. And from this chart, you can tell them that the top three measures are test scores, math GPA, and teacher recommendation. And in the next few slides, we're going to unpack each of them. So let's start with test scores. Remember, the law requires districts to consider multiple objective measures. And in this chart to the left, we report the number of test scores or number of assessments used by districts. And the darker the color, the more test scores they used. So you can tell majority of the district used two or more, and actually 80% of unified and high school districts, they used two or more assessment scores in their placement process. And statewide, the average is about 2. And in the right chart here, we list out some of the very common assessments. And the state standardized test, the Smarter Balanced Assessment, is the most popular, followed by district-developed assessments. And those districts-developed assessments, those are typically benchmark tests. So for instance, Algebra Readiness Assessment. So now let's go to teacher recommendation. Recall that right now with SB 359, districts are not allowed to use teacher recommendation unless teacher recommendations are to advanced students. And in our report, we actually found out that teacher recommendations are a very complex measure, and by removing teacher recommendations in the placement process, it may have some unintended consequences. To start with, in this chart, we'll list out the base for teacher recommendations, and you can see the base for teacher recommendations is very complex. And skills such as academic skills, which are in, I think it's red because there's some color inconsistency. So the academic skills, which are in red, And soft skills, which are in bluish bars, they both factor into teacher recommendations. And let's focus on the soft skills. The inclusion of soft skills sometimes is beneficial because some of those soft skills, such as student motivation, they're consistently good predictors of student success. And sometimes the inclusion of soft skills can be very beneficial. Because, for instance, when students do not test well, this does not necessarily mean that they are not ready. Because some students may not be very natural test takers, and some students, particularly among those Latino and African American students, due to a variety of factors, they tend to have low test scores. So if we're going to rely solely on test scores, those students are more likely to be held back because of their low test score. So in fact, in practice, some of those districts, they actually acknowledge the limitation and drawback of test scores. And over the years, they develop a systematic teacher recommendation rubric. So the rubric picks up some of the student attributes, such as student motivation, they're not captured by test scores. And in this way, they give students, particularly those minority students who are more likely to fall below the test score requirements, the opportunity to advance and progress through the high school curriculum. So here, we're not arguing for or against the use of teacher recommendation. We think moving forward, the critical issue is not whether teacher recommendations should be used at all. It is how teacher recommendations could be redesigned to complement other measures such as test scores. So now, the next set question we're interested in are districts aware of SB 359 and its requirement, and also the compliance of their policy. And this figure summarizes their awareness of and compliance with the law. And the very first thing you see in this chart are those red colored bars, and those represents the percentage of districts that are not familiar with SB 359 and its requirement. And you can see there's a huge variation based on district types. So for instance, in those rural districts, 69% of them were not aware of SB 359 and its requirement. The second thing you see from this chart are those greenish bars, and they represent whether or not districts' policy are in compliance with SB 359. And again, you can see districts are pretty much split in terms of their compliance with the law. And also remember the survey, the timing of the survey. The survey occurred earlier this year, and it was before the policy takes effect. So things might have changed as of today. And in this slide, we summarize the metrics districts use to gauge the success of their placement policy. This is very important because this gives districts the opportunity to identify the areas for improvement. And statewide, about 50% of them used at least one of those measures, and the top three are end-of-year math grade, percent of students advancing to the next level math course, and state assessment are the top three measures districts use. And there is some interesting variation based on district characteristics. So for instance, the high performance districts, they're more likely to consider more measures, and they're more likely to consider more test scores. So now we would like to talk about the concerns and challenges districts raised. And this is really important to make sure that all of the districts have the right toolbox to implement SB 359. And here we'll list some of the biggest challenges and concerns. The first has to do parental expectation. It's reasonable and it's understandable for parents to accelerate their students and to give them the best opportunities. But sometimes parents have too high expectation of their students, and one of the consequences is that parents are advancing their students too fast or too early, which oftentimes lead to those students struggling in those courses. The second concern has to do the need for math-based readiness measures. And all of the districts, regardless of their region, regardless of their size, regardless of their performance levels, they all need evidence-based readiness measures. And as I've mentioned briefly before, each of those measures, when used in isolation and when used alone, has its own problem. So really, the problem is how we can design, how we can design a system where all of those measures, they complement each other. And the third concern has to do with the alignment and communication issues, particularly under Common Core. As we all know, Common Core really affected math curriculum, math instruction, and math assessment. So there is some misalignment and miscommunication in terms of math content and math instruction, both within and across schools. So one of the examples one district gave us was not all of those pre-algebra classes are equal. So the next concern is equity concern. The equity concern manifests itself in two ways. So first, right now, under SB 359, districts have to rely on objective measures, and the district expressed the concern that a lot of those minority students, particularly Latino and African American students, are more likely to be held back as a result of this because they typically tend to have lower test scores. And another equity concern has to do with math support. So for instance, districts are worried that those students, they're not getting the same level of support outside of school. And the law touched on some of those concerns. And the next one, which is not addressed by the law, but it's very pressing, it has to do with teacher staffing. Sometimes when students are not advancing to the next level math courses, it's not necessarily because they're not ready, but because districts do not have the number and the quality of math teachers. In this figure, we summarize the percentage of districts that are affected by staffing shortage. And by staffing shortage, we mean the quantity and quality of math teachers. And statewide, which again is the horizontal bar, is 24%. So statewide, 24% of high school districts and unified school districts face teacher shortage. And the problem is more pressing among those rural districts. So for instance, more than half of them experience the teacher shortage in their math placement process. And again, going back to all of those challenges and issues, we acknowledge that this probably go beyond SB 359 and require a lot more work. So in the next slide, we're going to conclude and talk about the policy recommendations. I've talked about some of them briefly, but here we'll just list all of them together. And so moving forward, policymakers really need to clarify the use of teacher recommendations. And as we've mentioned before, the critical issue is not whether teacher recommendations should be used at all. It is how we can really redesign or re-engineer teacher recommendation so it works and it complements other measures such as test scores. And the second thing, districts, regardless of their district types, they all need valid, objective, and reliable readiness measures. They need those measures both to place their students and to gauge the success of their district policies. And we also encourage all of our local practitioners, our school districts, to use student data to assess and revise their placement guidelines. The idea is not to criticize or punish those districts. The idea or the purpose is to help them identify the area for improvement so they can help all of the students progress through the high school curriculum. In our report, we feature a district toolbox. In this toolbox, we include some detailed instructions for districts to detect and remove any bias in teacher recommendation. We also included instructions for districts to make sure that all of their measures, teacher recommendation, and also test scores are predictive student learning, because by the end of the day, if any measure is biased, it is because it's not predictive student learning. And we encourage all of our local practitioners to take a look at those instructions. And last, we want all state, last, the state and the local should work together to address capacity concerns or particularly to staffing shortage. And in the longer run, the state should continue its current investment in teacher training, teacher development, and teacher retention programs. And we all know the state has, in the past few years, the state has invested a lot of money in those areas. So we encourage the state to continue and potentially expand those efforts. But in the shorter run, in the shorter term, we think that districts should provide some online courses or maybe online academies, especially in areas where the students' course options are very limited due to staffing shortage. This is feasible because as the state transitions into online testing and online learning, schools' technology infrastructure is actually getting better and better. So schools are capable of doing that, and we encourage them to do so in order to provide learning opportunities to all of the students. And this concludes my presentation for today, and I'll look forward to all of your questions and thoughts. Okay, the mic is coming to you from behind.
Well, thank you very much. This is a very helpful report. I guess one of the concerns and questions I have is that how is it that in the high-need rural districts, maybe small districts, we have as high as 69% of districts are not familiar with this legislation or with this effort? Is it incumbent upon them to keep up to date with this, or is it at the statewide level? Is it State Department of Education? That's very concerning that at this time they are not even familiar with this mandated legislation.
Okay, so there are different aspects to the answer. So first, remember the survey. We did this survey earlier this year, and it was shortly after the law passed. So it's been 6 or 7 months. So maybe things have changed as of today. So and then the other thing is, as when it comes to awareness, we definitely agree. From the state perspective, there's a lot more work to do in order to raise awareness among those rural districts. So I'm not sure if that addressed your question, but
Whose responsibility is it for them to be aware? Is it the state, or is it incumbent upon the school districts to be aware of what's happening?
I think that probably is. That probably is if I'm understanding you correct, I think that probably is a bigger conversation. Maybe we can talk about that later today.
So thank you so much for that presentation. A couple questions for you. And I think the first one is, you start with very high numbers in terms of school districts having a policy, and then you there's a slide of great percentage of school districts that don't know about it. So I just want to make sure if there's something I missed.
Okay, so
those seem inconsistent to me, and I have another question after that.
Okay, so yeah, so one of the things, thank you for pointing it out, because one of the things I forgot to mention, sometimes people are confused by that, because a lot of them, so from this figure, you can tell statewide 86% of them had a policy, and among those had a policy, they're not aware of SB 359. So it is not. So they still had a policy. They are just not aware of the law.
Okay. The second question that I have for you, and by the way, if it's a law, it's upon the school districts to ensure that they're compliant with the law. If not, they could get sued. But the second question that I have is, you talk about the unintended consequences of teacher recommendation. And my question to you, if the law states clearly that teacher recommendations can only be used to advance students, where you would be thinking that they're using motivation and other skills to basically recommend that the kid moves forward, Why would that have an unintended consequence?
I think it has to do a couple of things. So first, when we're talking with districts, a lot of their interpretation is, because now the law restricts the use of teacher recommendation and they're concerned about compliance, so they remove teacher recommendation altogether. So I think, yeah, so that is one of the issue. And then the other issue is, even, because as you've mentioned, the law actually acknowledged that in some cases teacher recommendation could be used, but districts still, they need those, they do not know how they can redesign their teacher recommendation to work with, test scores. So I think by the end of the day, it all boils down to what kind of measures, whether or not they're teacher recommendation or whether or not they're test scores, they're best predictors of student learning. So I think, as we've mentioned, we're not arguing for or against. We're just thinking, by the end of the day, we need valid, reliable, and objective measures that predict student learning. So it all boils down to which predictors are the best. Mm-hmm. Sure.
Thank you. You talk about the testing as an indicator, and I see the heavily relied on the last one slide on the smart and balanced assessment. But the problem is the smart and balanced assessment is not designed for the diagnostic purpose. And as James Poppin said, this large-scale assessment is probably lack of the sensitivity to the classroom instruction. And the policy implication, I was wondering if it's educating the fields, let them know, and this is not a diagnostic testing. It's not built that way. Probably local assessment would be more, I kind of think it's more sensitive to the classroom learning.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think the bigger picture than you're trying to get is what are some of the limits of those assessments. And as you've mentioned, the Smarter Balanced it's a statewide assessment and it's given annually to students. And one of the problems with Smarter Balance, as you've mentioned, is it's not designed for this purpose. And the other problem is with Smarter Balance is because it's given to students once a year, so it missed out the opportunity to identify how students are actually progressing throughout the year. So, and some of the districts, they realize the problem with state standardized assessments, so they actually develop so they actually develop some of those formative assessment and also maybe in some cases district benchmark assessment to complement state standardized assessments. So, and then the other thing that you've mentioned is some of those diagnostic exams, they actually have their own problem. So for instance, MDDP, I don't know if you so for those of you who are not familiar with MDDP, it's a diagnostic assessments that are commonly used by districts to assess how students are performing throughout the year. So the problem with MDDP is it's because again, it's not designed for placement process. And actually in one of those districts, the problem with MDTP is that it does not actually predict how students are doing in the next math courses. And in some worst case scenario, it's as good as a random draw. So I think, when it comes to assessment, there are some problems with each of them as well. So again, going back to, as we've emphasized, every measure when used, on its own and in isolation has its own problem. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, I think the key, because all these are commercially made off-the-shelf tests. So the key is really developing an assessment which is sensitive to the classroom learning rather than the standardized testing. I think that's the issue.
Yeah, so a lot of those are formative, classroom formative assessment, and one of the concern about those assessment is internal validity and also reliability issue. Again, we don't want to get into testing and assessment itself, but I think there are concerns about each of those measures. So definitely, the problem is more the task is more daunting than we think. So.
Well, the issue you talk about the reliability and the validity. Those are the because of this, those will sacrifice the sensitivity of the classroom learning. So that's always a struggle of the reliability and the validity because of the reliability and the validity. So we make sure the IRT and we make sure the good students always score high, low students always score low. That's the sacrifice of the sensitivity to the classroom. So that's always a struggle, probably policy making sure that recognize that.
So the SB 359 mentions a lot about incoming ninth graders, but with the Common Core standards, now that we have 7th grade math and 8th grade math in middle school, we don't really have that much of an issue with placement into 9th grade, assuming they took 7th grade math and 7th grade, 8th grade math and 8th grade. In our district, they would go into math 1 as a 9th grader. So there's not really this like repeating algebra issue like we used to have because we don't have algebra anymore. So for our district, after math 1, we do have a decision point, and some kids go to math 2 and some kids go to what we call math 2 plus, which is the accelerated pathway. So we're focusing all of our placement policies on that decision point. So just kind of a comment that it's not really about the entering high school or entering 9th grade. It's kind of whenever you take math 1, whether it be in 8th grade or 9th grade, after that comes a decision point, and that's where we're focusing our placement policies. So that's just kind of a comment, but my question is about the testing, and we did create a test for our district as part of our placement policy, and I'm wondering what the process is for figuring out how that test is valid and reliable and objective, because we created it and we gave it, but
Yeah, so like you said, even though SB 359 targets, 9th grade, but in our report, we're looking at a placement in more general terms. So all of our findings, those apply to all of other grades. And so the other thing, going back to the how question you raised. So as I've mentioned in our report, we have a district toolbox. So we include some details instructions. So you can just take a look and then see, if you can just follow. Those are pretty easy to follow. So I would encourage you to take a look. And also, we can chat a little bit more later after the conversation, because I would be curious to know the assessment you use and also some of the problems you have.
Sure, thank you. And we had our, assessment, research, and evaluation department look at the scores once it was done and determine kind of a cut score for what we used for placement. And I'm wondering, it ended up being that we ended up recommending like 20% of our students be in this accelerated pathway, which I think is generally more than we used to have. And so I'm interested in also finding out kind of what other districts' numbers are and if that sounds reasonable or where we should be at.
Yeah, definitely, because again, every district is unique in terms of student body and also in terms of, capacity. So, but definitely I'll be, let's connect after the presentation, and then so we can talk more. Okay, great. Okay, there's a hand over here.
Oh, you did mention teachers, and most people, I think, know that in the United States, 2/3 of our teachers come from the bottom half of their graduating class in college. Okay, and the countries that do very well select their teachers, and they don't admit teachers to teacher training unless they're in the top third of their class. And so it seems like that would have a big impact on the scores. General knowledge, I think that the high-performing schools have the highest performing teachers, and the lowest performing teachers only are assigned to teach minority classes to a very substantial extent.
Yeah, we do acknowledge, teacher quality is a really important factor in helping students learn. And also, as we, in our report, we weren't really focused on, how to attract or retain best teachers. But the only way and the only time we talked about teachers are sometimes those course options are limited because they couldn't find enough teachers and they couldn't find enough quality teachers. So going back to your comment, we definitely agree teacher quality actually is the single most important school level factor in student learning. And I think for policymakers from the federal to state to local level, definitely there's a lot more work to do in order to change the teacher in order to improve the quality of the entire teaching profession. So so that is my feedback. Okay. So.
Hi, how are you? Can you
Hi.
go to the
Hi.
slide with your recommendations real quick?
Sure.
Wanted to talk a little bit and get your impressions, but first, a comment on something you just said, which was identify valid, objective, and reliable readiness measures. Isn't that just where we're at as a state in general right now with most things in terms of our new accountability system? And there are a number of measures, including the readiness and grit measures that you're talking about. That I know people are working real hard. So if they can hit those targets, we might actually have the assessments to help give teachers and systems more reliable measures. So I think that's a consequence of where we're at in the state in general. But in terms of implementation, which is I'm mostly curious about, we really, when I see your recommendations, I just see that as an indicator of how you really can be successful in this, but you got to think about it more than just a protocol. That it really
Definitely.
is about, if you want to reach that equity value that we're getting towards, how are we aligning? So when you talk about your alignment, you mentioned something about districts were saying something's out of alignment. It really is. How do we create a self-fulfilling prophecy that we're in fact giving kids who are ready everything they need to be successful, and that our systems can meet them there? When I hear my colleague here raising the question of, we're seeing an increase of this protocol now in placement, which means, do I now have the teachers and the class space in my master schedule to meet that? And for far too long, the equity consequences is that our systems, they don't operate that way connected. They say, here's so much space, how many kids can I fill in there? And that's what the challenge is for us, is what are the ways we're going to unpack this to think about it more beyond just a protocol, but what are the supports that are necessary where now students and their needs are driving how our systems create themselves to meet that need. And so wondering what your thoughts are in terms of the recommendations of holistically, what does it mean for these things to operate together?
Okay, so the first, well, thanks for those comments. So going back to your very first comment, I think, I definitely agree. And actually, a lot of those districts we talked to were saying something like, we're hoping that, because right now the state is trying to figure out its college and career readiness. And the districts are saying, okay, right now we don't have a very good, valid, or reliable measures, but we're hoping once the State Board of Education could give us some very good indicators, maybe we can borrow some of those indicators there. So definitely, I agree with what you said. And then going back to your second comment, definitely this goes way beyond a math placement process or protocol. And actually, we did not include this in our report, but we're happy to share those results. In our survey, we also asked them about the math support system, because as you said, math support system probably is equally or maybe even more important than just a placement, process. And a lot of those, equity concerns, of course, they occurred, they occur during the placement process, but a lot of those equity, actually happen outside of schools. So for instance, one of those common concerns that districts have are those low-income minority kids. When they get out of school, they do not get the same level of support, at home compared to other kids. So I think, equity concern definitely goes beyond math placement, and also it goes, maybe it just goes beyond math education as well. So I think, definitely it requires a lot more coherent efforts from all stakeholders to address this problem. But we definitely think, math placement, this is a very good, first step to address those, widespread equity issues in the entire education system. So we're hoping to, share some of the results on math support systems with you guys later, because we do see some interesting things there. So for instance, we're trying to identify some of the very good, practices. And when we're looking at when we're talking to high performance districts, and remember some of them are actually high minority, high poverty districts. So actually, those districts, they're more likely to emphasize peer mentoring in their math support system. Some districts, of course, they have the capacity, so sometimes they develop an app. They have an app to encourage peer support. But in those high poverty, high income, high minority districts, they do not have the capacity. So what they do instead is have their algebra honor students to tutor their algebra students. So I think definitely it goes way beyond a protocol to address the equity issues, and we'll for sure to share some of the results with you on that. Mm-hmm.
This is a quick follow-up question to Valerie. So the question that you asked when they told you about teacher shortage, was the question enough for you to infer that because there's teacher shortages, they're not able to open enough slots in advanced mathematics placement, and that's why they're keeping kids back?
Right. So we asked both, capacity constraint and also particularly math teacher shortage. So sometimes, probably you've heard, in some districts, they mention something like enrollment cap. So all of those courses are capped, they're capped out after reaching certain limit. So we definitely asked specifically. Okay.
First, let me say a great presentation. I have a question as an advocate for our councilman in the district I'm in. I hear a lot of teacher evaluations and teacher objects as to how they're teaching, but I have to say, out of all the schools I visit, what more is the teacher to do to be certified as a quality teacher? And I feel for these teachers a lot, because personally I think they're doing the best that they can do with what little they have. And what I see a lot of is there's not enough parent involvement to create that atmosphere where the teacher can do the best and at the top that he or she is at.
So I think that's again, that goes beyond this report. I think you're we acknowledge, teacher quality or quality teacher, is very important, probably is one of the most important school factor that contributed to student learning. But again, in our report, we really didn't get the opportunity to see, how we can address incoming teacher pool and also improve the existing teacher pool. So I'm afraid I don't have a clear answer for you, but I'll be happy to refer you to some, there are some, some other states and also some other cities are doing some innovative work in terms of teacher quality, and I'll be happy to refer you to some articles on that.
I'm hearing a lot about poverty. That sounds like a stereotype. Minorities sound like a stereotype. Uninvolved parents, definitely a stereotype. And I just wanted to point that out because there are a lot of factors. And it's not that the parents don't care or they don't want to be involved. And it's a big discussion. I'm not going to get into it. But I had a question about income of teachers, because I'm assuming, and I wondered if you studied this, I assume the highly rated, highly motivated teachers are also highly paid compared to perhaps a rural area with a smaller tax base. And I was wondering if part of the issue is they can't attract the teachers because they can't pay them commensurate salaries.
I think in our report, we unfortunately did not talk about, for instance, in those rural areas, then they face, more than half of them had a teacher shortage during their math placement process. And we unfortunately did not get the opportunity to ask them, why? Because traditionally, definitely, generally speaking, we know those areas had had a problem in terms of attracting and retaining teachers. Salary could be a factor, or school administration could be a factor, or school learning environment could be a factor. I think by the end of the day, probably the answer is a combination of factors, both financial and non-financial factors. But in our report, we did not get the opportunity to unpack that a little bit. But again, I know in the literature there is some great work being done on that. So, and I'll be happy to refer you to some more literatures on that. Okay, so if there's no questions, well, thank you for coming to our event.